The snow crunched beneath their boots, the sharp sound breaking the eerie quiet of the forest. A bitter wind swept between the towering pine trees, rustling their branches like a whispering warning. Emily tightened her scarf around her neck, the cold biting at her exposed skin. Her breath escaped in small clouds that quickly dissolved into the frozen air. Somewhere ahead, Ryan led the way, his back straight, steps purposeful, as if putting distance between them and civilization could somehow mend the fractures between them. They had been walking for hours. When Ryan first proposed the trip, Emily had hesitated. A winter hike through the remote wilderness, 3 miles from the nearest ranger station, seemed like a risky idea, especially given how things had been between them. But Ryan had been insistent. "We need this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It'll be good for us, Em. No distractions. Just us and nature." She had reluctantly agreed, though deep down, Emily feared they were beyond saving. Weeks of tense arguments had eroded their connection, leaving behind resentment and silence. The once warm, playful exchanges between them were now laced with barbs. Still, she clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, the wilderness would strip away the noise and bring them back to each other. But as the hours wore on, Emily felt the weight of something pressing down on her, a presence as subtle as it was unsettling. The forest seemed too quiet, as if the world had paused to watch them. Ryan glanced back, his jaw tight. "You doing okay?" he asked, though his tone was more perfunctory than concerned. Emily nodded, even though she was anything but okay. "Yeah, just tired." He gave a short nod and turned away, his long strides putting more space between them. Emily trailed behind, feeling the sting of his emotional distance as keenly as the cold. She had thought this trip was supposed to bring them closer, but it already felt like just another arena for their silent war. The trail twisted deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser, their branches heavy with snow. Emily tried to focus on the beauty around her, the delicate lace of frost on the leaves, the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden beams, but the unease gnawed at her. A strange sound interrupted her thoughts, a faint rustling in the underbrush. She paused, straining her ears, but the forest swallowed the sound before she could place it. "Ryan, wait," she called, quickening her steps to catch up. "Did you hear that?" He stopped, looking over his shoulder with a trace of annoyance. "It's probably just a squirrel or something." "Or something," she muttered, glancing back toward the underbrush. The thought of what else might be lurking in these woods made her stomach tighten. They pressed on, the forest growing darker as the afternoon wore on. Shadows stretched across the snow, twisting into strange shapes that danced at the edge of Emily's vision. She shivered, tugging her coat tighter around her. As they hiked, she noticed tracks, large paw-shaped impressions pressed deep into the snow. Emily crouched down to examine them, her breath catching in her throat. The prints were fresh. Too fresh. "Ryan," she called softly, a thread of tension in her voice. "Come look at this." He sighed audibly, but walked back to where she knelt. "What is it now?" "Tracks." She pointed, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're big. Could be a wolf." Ryan's eyes narrowed as he studied the prints. "They're not close. Relax." Emily's fingers twitched as she traced the outline of the paw print in the snow. Something about it felt wrong. She knew animals left tracks all the time, but these weren't the random patterns of a passing creature. These prints seemed to follow a path, a deliberate one, as if the animal had been circling. Ryan straightened and gave her a tight-lipped smile. "Come on. We'll lose daylight if we stop every time you see something." Emily stood reluctantly, brushing snow from her gloves. The tension between them was palpable, an invisible force pulling them in opposite directions. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he knew what he was doing. but the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. As they continued along the trail, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees like a distant scream. The temperature dropped, and Emily felt the cold settle into her bones. Her thoughts drifted to the campsite they had planned to reach by nightfall. Would it feel safe once the sun disappeared? The howl came suddenly, low and mournful, echoing through the forest like a ghostly song. Emily froze, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. Ryan slowed but didn't stop. "It's just a wolf," he said over his shoulder, his voice annoyingly calm. "They're not interested in us." But Emily wasn't so sure. She knew enough about wolves to know that they were cautious creatures, silent hunters, patient and calculating. And if they were hearing howls now, it meant the pack was communicating, coordinating. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She scanned the forest around them, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows, stretching endlessly in every direction. Ryan kept moving, seemingly unaffected by the unease settling over them. Emily bit her lip, resisting the urge to call out again. He hated when she worried, said she was too anxious for her own good. But how could she not be, with the forest closing in around them and the howls growing louder with each passing minute? They trudged on in silence, the distance between them both physical and emotional. Emily stared at Ryan's back, frustration bubbling in her chest. She loved him, but sometimes he made it so damn hard. It wasn't just the coldness, the way he shut her out when things got tough. It was the subtle, dismissive way he treated her fears, as if they were just another inconvenience to endure. The shadows deepened, and the sky shifted from blue to a dusky gray. They were running out of time. Emily quickened her pace, her boots slipping on the uneven snow. The howl came again, this time closer, too close. Ryan stopped abruptly, and Emily nearly bumped into him. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice shaky. He didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on something in the distance, a dark shape moving through the trees, just on the edge of their vision. Emily followed his gaze, her heart leaping into her throat. It was there, just for a second, a flash of fur, the gleam of amber eyes, and then it was gone, swallowed by the forest. Ryan's jaw tightened. "We need to keep moving." Emily nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs. But as they set off again, a terrible thought took root in her mind. They weren't alone in the forest. And whatever was out there wasn't just passing through, it was following them. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing against Emily's chest as they pushed deeper into the wilderness. The forest had an oppressive stillness, broken only by the sound of their boots crunching through the snow. The sun was sinking rapidly, its light bleeding into streaks of pink and purple across the sky, and soon they would be plunged into darkness. Emily hugged herself, trying to suppress the rising sense of dread clawing at her insides. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The flash of fur they had seen earlier haunted her mind, and the distant howls replayed like a broken record. Ryan led the way without a word, his jaw clenched in stubborn determination. She could tell he was uneasy, too, though he would never admit it. He had always been the kind to push forward, ignoring warning signs and convincing himself that everything would be fine if they just kept going. Emily, however, couldn't ignore the growing weight of the situation. Every step they took felt like it was pulling them deeper into something they couldn't escape. As they rounded a bend in the trail, the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the last of the light. Emily glanced down and saw them again, those paw prints, fresh, deep, and unmistakably wolf tracks. They weaved between the trees, crisscrossing the path as if marking their territory. "Ryan," she whispered urgently, grabbing his arm, "look at the tracks. They're everywhere." He sighed in exasperation, yanking his arm free. "You're overreacting. Wolves travel in packs. It's normal." Emily stared at him, incredulous. "Normal? These tracks are fresh. They're close, Ryan." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "We'll make camp soon. Once we have a fire going, they won't come near us." Emily shook her head, her pulse quickening. "We should turn back. It's getting dark, and if there's a pack nearby—" "We're not turning back!" Ryan snapped, his voice cutting through the still air like a whip. His outburst startled her, and for a moment the tension between them hung thick and heavy. Emily bit her lip, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wanted to fight him on this, to insist that they leave, but she knew it wouldn't do any good. Ryan was stubborn to a fault. Instead, she gave him a cold, tight nod. "Fine, but we need to keep moving. We're sitting ducks out here." The sky deepened to an ominous gray as they hurried along the trail, their footsteps quick and uneven. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see glowing eyes peering at them from the shadows. And then it happened. A soft rustling sound, barely audible, reached her ears. It was faint, so faint that she thought she might have imagined it. But then she heard it again, a deliberate, careful movement through the underbrush, like something following just out of sight. "Ryan," she hissed, her voice sharp with fear. "Something's behind us." He stopped abruptly, spinning around to face the forest. His eyes scanned the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and snow and endless shadows. "You're imagining things," he said flatly, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. Emily shook her head, her heart pounding. "I'm not. I heard something." Ryan hesitated, glancing toward the trail ahead. They were at a crossroads. Keep moving or stop and investigate. Every instinct told Emily that they needed to get out of the forest fast, but Ryan's pride was a stubborn thing, and she knew he would never back down without a fight. "Fine," he muttered, pulling a flashlight from his backpack. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "Ryan, no," Emily pleaded, panic rising in her chest. "Don't go off the trail." He ignored her, clicking the flashlight on and disappearing into the trees. The beam of light bobbed in the darkness as he moved deeper into the forest, leaving Emily alone on the path. Her heart raced, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, but she stayed rooted in place, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Minutes passed, agonizing, endless minutes. The silence pressed in on her, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of Ryan's return, but all she heard was her own rapid heartbeat. And then the howling began again. It was louder this time, closer, a mournful, chilling sound that echoed through the forest like a warning. Emily's blood ran cold. "Ryan!" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. The flashlight beam flickered in the distance, and then it went out, plunging everything into darkness. Panic gripped her. She fumbled with her own flashlight, her hand shaking as she clicked it on. The narrow beam sliced through the shadows, revealing nothing but trees and snow. "Ryan!" she called again, louder this time. Still, no answer. Tears stung her eyes as she struggled to keep calm. She couldn't leave him out there. She had to find him. Taking a deep breath, she stepped off the trail, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The forest seemed to swallow her whole, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Every sound was amplified, the crunch of her boots, the rasp of her breath, the soft rustling of leaves overhead. And then she saw it. Just ahead, caught in the weak beam of her flashlight, was Ryan's backpack, lying discarded in the snow, torn open as if by claws. Emily's heart dropped. She rushed forward, her flashlight sweeping over the ground. The snow was disturbed, scattered with paw prints and drag marks. "Ryan!" she shouted, her voice breaking. The only response was the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. Terror clawed at her throat as she stood there, alone in the darkness, the weight of the forest pressing down on her. Ryan was gone. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of the light, the wolves were waiting. Emily stood frozen, her breath shallow and uneven. The torn backpack lay at her feet, the snow around it churned with paw prints, and the distinct drag marks of something heavy, Ryan's body perhaps, being pulled away. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat thundering in her ears like a drum signaling danger. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, to turn back, to flee from whatever was lurking just beyond the reach of her flashlight beam. But she couldn't leave him. No matter how broken their relationship was, she couldn't just abandon Ryan to the wolves. With a shaking hand, she adjusted the flashlight and pressed forward, following the trail of disturbed snow. The forest was darker now, the dense canopy overhead blocking out even the faint glow of the moon. Shadows loomed on all sides, and the cold bit deep into her skin, making her limbs stiff and uncooperative. The howling returned, closer now, so close it made Emily's hair stand on end. She tried to focus, to force her legs to move faster, but the fear slowed her down, made her feel as though she were running through molasses. Then she heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the air, followed by the sound of something heavy shifting through the snow. She stopped dead in her tracks, swinging the flashlight wildly from side to side, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Her light caught a flash of fur, gray and mottled, blending perfectly with the snowy landscape. And then, out of the darkness, they emerged. The wolves. They moved silently, their bodies sleek and powerful, their eyes glowing amber in the dim light. 7 of them, each one larger than the last, their breath visible in the cold night air. They fanned out in a wide circle, surrounding Emily with the practiced precision of hunters. Her throat tightened with fear. She knew what they were doing, testing her, waiting for her to make a move. If she ran, they would chase her. If she fought, they would tear her apart. And then she saw him. Ryan lay crumpled in the snow a few feet away, half conscious and shivering. His face was pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. One of the wolves stood over him, its teeth bared in a silent snarl. Emily's heart twisted painfully in her chest. This was it. This was the moment everything hinged on. She could run, save herself, and leave Ryan to his fate. Or she could stand her ground, knowing full well what that choice could cost her. Ryan's eyes flickered open, his gaze locking with hers. There was fear in his expression, real, raw fear, and something else, regret. "Emily," he whispered, his voice weak and desperate. "Help me." Her mind raced. If she ran toward him, the wolves would pounce. If she did nothing, Ryan would die. And deep down, she wasn't sure she had it in her to forgive him for what he had done, shoving her toward the wolves, trying to save himself. The lead wolf stepped closer, its growl deepening, and Emily knew she was out of time. She had to make a decision. And then, in a move that surprised even herself, she did the unthinkable. Emily dropped her flashlight into the snow and stepped forward, slowly raising her arms to her sides. She didn't run, didn't scream. Instead, she locked eyes with the lead wolf and held its gaze, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. The wolf snarled, baring its sharp teeth, but it didn't move. The other wolves shifted restlessly, their eyes flicking between Emily and Ryan, uncertain about this unexpected turn of events. Emily took another step forward, her gaze unwavering. "You don't want him," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "Take me." Ryan's eyes widened in disbelief. "Emily, no." But she ignored him. She had made her choice. She wasn't going to let the wolves take him. Not like this. The lead wolf tilted its head, studying her with a strange intelligence, as if weighing her offer. Emily held her breath, waiting for the inevitable attack. And then, to her astonishment, the wolf backed away. The other wolves followed suit, their snarls softening into low whines. One by one, they retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the forest as silently as they had appeared. Emily stood there, stunned, her heart racing in her chest. She had done it. Somehow she had stopped the wolves. She turned to Ryan, who was staring at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "How?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Emily knelt beside him, helping him sit up. "I don't know," she admitted, her hands trembling. "I just knew I couldn't let them take you." Ryan's eyes filled with tears, whether from gratitude or guilt, Emily couldn't tell. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They were alive. They had survived. Together they made their way back to the trail, leaning on each other for support. The night was still, the forest once again silent. But Emily knew the wolves were still out there, watching from the shadows. And somehow, that knowledge gave her peace. Ryan leaned heavily on Emily as they trudged along the trail, their limbs stiff from the cold, and their hearts still racing from the encounter. The weight of what had just happened clung to the air between them, thick, raw, and unspoken. Emily could feel the wolves' presence lingering, as if their amber eyes were still watching from the shadows. The wind howled through the forest, scattering loose snow into the air like tiny shards of glass. Ryan stumbled, groaning in pain, and Emily caught him before he could fall. His ankle was twisted, swollen beneath his boot, and his face was pale from the cold and exhaustion. "We need to find shelter," she whispered, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. The cold was becoming more brutal, and with nightfall they would be exposed to both the elements and the predators lurking in the woods. Ryan gritted his teeth, clearly fighting the pain. "I don't think I can make it far." Emily scanned the forest, her heart sinking. There was no campsite in sight, no cabin or structure to shield them. They were completely alone out here, and time was running out. Just then, a growl rumbled through the forest, low and ominous. Emily froze. The wolves hadn't left after all. They had been waiting, watching. And now they were ready to strike. Ryan swore under his breath, panic flickering in his eyes. "They're coming back." Emily tightened her grip on him, fear clawing at her insides. The wolves weren't going to retreat this time. They had tested them, and now they would finish what they started. Suddenly, the first wolf stepped into the clearing, its fur bristling in the wind, teeth bared. The others followed, emerging from the shadows with eerie silence, their glowing eyes fixed on Emily and Ryan. "We have to run," Ryan whispered urgently, his voice tight with fear. But Emily knew that running would only trigger their instinct to chase. She shook her head, her heart thundering in her chest. "We can't outrun them, not with your ankle." Ryan's breathing grew ragged. "Then what do we do?" Emily's mind raced, searching for a plan, an escape, anything that could save them. But the wolves were closing in, their circle tightening, leaving them with no way out. The lead wolf let out a bone-chilling growl, and the others echoed it, their snarls filling the air like a warning drumbeat. The pack advanced slowly, savoring the moment, as if they knew victory was inevitable. Ryan's hand tightened around Emily's arm, and she felt his fear seep into her bones. This was it. This was how it would end. But then something inside Emily shifted. a fierce primal instinct she didn't know she had. She refused to die here. Not like this. "Get behind me," she whispered to Ryan, her voice steady despite the terror roaring through her veins. Ryan hesitated, but the look in Emily's eyes left no room for argument. He staggered behind her, clutching his injured ankle as Emily faced the wolves head-on. The lead wolf snarled, and the others followed suit, inching closer. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling at her sides. But she stood her ground, refusing to show fear. "You want us?" she whispered, her voice low and unwavering. "Come and get us!" For a moment the forest seemed to hold its breath. The wolves paused, their glowing eyes locked on Emily, their muscles coiled, ready to strike. And then, all at once, they attacked. The lead wolf lunged, teeth flashing in the dim light. Emily moved on instinct, shoving Ryan aside as the beast sailed past them, missing by inches. The other wolves followed, a blur of fur and claws, and chaos erupted in the clearing. Emily grabbed a fallen branch, swinging it wildly as the wolves closed in. One of them snapped at her leg, and she kicked out, adrenaline surging through her veins. Ryan fought beside her, wielding a jagged rock, but his movements were sluggish from pain. The wolves were relentless, circling, lunging, testing their defenses. Emily could feel her strength waning, her arms burning from the effort of swinging the branch. Sweat mingled with the cold air, stinging her eyes, but she refused to give in. One of the wolves lunged for Ryan, and Emily reacted without thinking. She dove between them, the wolf's jaws snapping inches from her face. She felt a sharp pain as its teeth grazed her arm, tearing through her jacket, but she didn't stop. She grabbed the wolf by its fur, shoving it away with every ounce of strength she had left. Ryan cried out, his voice hoarse with fear. "Emily, behind you!" She spun just in time to see the lead wolf charging again, its amber eyes glowing with deadly intent. Emily braced herself, but before the beast could reach her, something strange happened. The lead wolf stopped. It skidded to a halt just inches from Emily, its ears flattened against its head. The other wolves followed suit, their snarls fading into uneasy whines. Emily stood frozen, panting heavily, her hands clenched around the branch. The lead wolf stared at her, something unreadable flickering in its eyes, something that almost looked like respect. And then, without warning, the pack turned and melted back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as silently as they had come. Emily collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Her entire body trembled from exhaustion and fear, but they were alive. They had survived. Ryan crawled over to her, his face pale and drawn. How did you do that?" he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. Emily shook her head, her breath hitching in her chest. "I don't know." Ryan pulled her into a tight embrace, his arms trembling. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "After everything, you still saved me." Emily rested her forehead against his shoulder, her mind spinning. She didn't have the energy to unpack the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Relief, anger, betrayal, love. All she knew was that, for now, they were alive. As the wind whispered through the trees, Emily closed her eyes and held on to Ryan, savoring the fragile peace that had settled over the forest. For now, the wolves were gone. But deep down, she knew that their presence would linger, etched into her bones, a reminder of the night she had stood her ground and faced the wild. And somehow, in facing the wolves, she had found a part of herself she never knew existed. A part that refused to be thrown to the wolves ever again. The night was still, the forest hushed as if the earth itself was catching its breath. The only sound was the soft crunch of Emily's boots in the snow as she and Ryan limped along the trail, their bodies battered but alive. The ordeal with the wolves lingered in the air between them, thick with unspoken emotions and unresolved tension. They reached a small clearing and stopped, both of them too exhausted to continue. Ryan collapsed onto the snow, clutching his swollen ankle, while Emily slumped beside him, her breath billowing in clouds. For a while they sat in silence, the enormity of what they had just survived slowly sinking in. Emily gazed up at the sky, where the stars twinkled coldly above them. The night seemed almost peaceful now, as if the forest had returned to its natural rhythm. But peace didn't come easily. Emily's mind churned with the memories of the encounter, Ryan throwing her toward the wolves to save himself, the led wolf halting just inches from her, and the strange connection she had felt with the pack. Ryan broke the silence first, his voice hoarse and quiet. "Emily, I don't know how to say this." He looked down at his hands, the weight of shame pressing visibly on his shoulders. "What I did back there, Emily shook her head, stopping him mid-sentence. "You don't have to say anything, Ryan. I know." His eyes glistened with guilt. I thought they would kill you. And I let it happen." The words hung between them, raw and painful. For a moment Emily was silent, staring at the ground as she processed everything. She could feel the bitterness rising, the betrayal cutting deep. But mixed with it was something else, an odd clarity. She had saved him, not because he deserved it, but because she couldn't live with herself if she didn't. "You were scared," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "And people do stupid things when they're scared." Ryan's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of her forgiveness was almost heavier than the guilt. "I don't deserve it," he whispered. "No, you don't." Emily's voice was firm, but not unkind. "But that's not the point." Driver Ryan looked at her, his eyes filled with something like awe. "You could have left me." Emily smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I could have, but I didn't." The wolves' decision to spare her still puzzled her. Maybe it had been luck. Maybe it had been something deeper, a recognition, perhaps, that Emily was no longer afraid. The wild, after all, respects strength. And in that moment, Emily had discovered hers. Ryan shifted beside her, wincing from the pain in his ankle. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice tentative. Emily glanced at the dark forest surrounding them. "We keep moving." They would have to find a ranger station, report the encounter, and make their way back to safety. But Emily knew that the journey ahead wasn't just about surviving the forest. It was about figuring out what came next for them. The wilderness had exposed the truth about Ryan, about herself, about the fragile threads that held their relationship together. And now that the truth was out in the open, Emily wasn't sure if things could ever go back to the way they were. They struggled to their feet, leaning on each other for support, and began to walk again. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the cold bit at their skin, but this time it felt different. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. As they made their way through the dark forest, Emily found herself thinking about the wolves. Not as monsters, but as creatures following their instincts. They weren't evil or malicious. They were simply trying to survive in a world that was as harsh and unforgiving as the wilderness itself. And in a way, Emily realized, she and the wolves weren't so different. They had all been thrown into the wild, forced to fight for survival. But the wolves had spared her, and in doing so, they had given her something priceless, a sense of clarity and strength that she never knew she had. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Emily knew what she had to do. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced the wild, looked death in the eye, and emerged stronger. Ryan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" Emily smiled softly, her breath forming a mist in the cold morning air. "Yeah," she said, surprising herself with the truth in her words. "I think I am." They walked on, the forest gradually thinning as they neared the trailhead. And as they moved forward, Emily knew that whatever lay ahead, whether it was with Ryan or without him, she would be ready, because she had learned something out here in the wilderness. Sometimes the wolves don't kill you. Sometimes they set you free. As the screen fades to black, a deep voice echoes, calling the audience to action. Thanks for watching the video. For more video like this, you have to like the video, subscribe our channel, and press bell icon.